If you didn't see my last couple of videos, Oh, the People You'll Meet, covering the jazz personalities Ben Pickering came into contact with during the 1920s and 30s, I highly recommend watching that first. This video might make a little more sense if you have some context. In any event, this video covers some of the folks that were active in the 1940s jazz and swing scene. Of course, the most significant event of the early 1940s was World War II, but it's important to remember that the music world did not come to a standstill. In fact, as often happens, wars can stoke a musician's creativity as they try to find an outlet for pent-up emotions. Some of the most historically significant pieces of music, whether patriotic or anti-war, have been the result of man's inhumanity to their fellow man. Before we jump in, I wanted to circle back to the last episode for just a few minutes. It was only after posting that video that I found a photo of Ugo Filippini that I had left out and wanted to make sure people got to see that. I failed to realize that I had this photo that I'd scanned several months ago, and that got lost, and I just found it, so I wanted to get it out there. This is a very rare photo, in fact, probably one of a kind. Ugo Filippini is not a guy you hear much about these days, even in early jazz music circles. So it's significant in that regard. For a little bit more information on Filippini, I invite you to check out my last video. So onward to the 1940s, the popularity of what became known as swing music really took off in the late 1930s, and by 1940 was the predominant form of popular music, at least within the United States. Band leaders like Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, and Tommy Dorsey led the way. A number of classically trained musicians switched to jazz and its offshoot, now referred to as swing, seeing it as their ticket to fame and fortune. One such man was Jan Sabat. Born Jakob Savatnik in Shmusk, Russian Empire, he was raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and trained classically in violin. Now, he was a true prodigy, and he was offered a position in Leopold Stokowski's Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra at a young age, a position that he originally turned down due to his studies. Now, he later did join Stokowski's orchestra, with whom he played for 11 years. By 1937, he formed his own orchestra, and in 1938, he and his top hatters were the staff orchestra at KYW-NBC in Philadelphia, playing 5 days a week, with Saturday's one-hour show being broadcast coast to coast. Now, this was still primarily classical and what we would now call easy listening music, not jazz. However, as the 1940s dawned, he shifted to more popular music, initially as program director at KYW. As band leader, he developed his unique shuffle rhythm, which remained his trademark. One particularly bold move on Sabat's part was signing George Bon Bon Tunel to sing with the Top Hatters. Bon Bon was one of the first African Americans to sing with a white band, so it's really significant. Ben joined Sabat in 1941 and played with him for a little over a year, at least as far as I can tell. He was with them for certain in 1942, where he appeared in the Universal Studios short film Serenade and Swing, featuring vocalist Martha Tilton. In 1944, Ben was with Charlie Barnett. I'm not entirely certain where he was from 1942 to 44, so I don't know the circumstances under which he met up with Barnett. Barnett was a big deal back in the 1930s and 40s, not only as a popular recording artist, but as an arranger and one of the progenitors of the swing style of music. While Barnett was something of a libertine in his personal life, he was also notable for being one of the first band leaders to racially integrate his band. African-American trumpeters Roy Eldridge and Frankie Newton and bassist John Kirby were added to his orchestra in 1937. He also employed Lena Horne as vocalist, and this was just a huge step forward at the time. By November of 1944, Ben had joined Tony Pastor's orchestra. Pastor was a seasoned tenor saxophone player whose career started back in 1927. He played with many different acts over the years, including Joe Venuti, which, as we covered in the last episode, Ben had played with in 1936 and 37. Now, there isn't a lot of information I can find on Ben's time with Pastor, but I suspect he was not terribly happy with his situation there. from what little I knew about my uncle and what I've been able to find out about Pastor and his fondness for what has been termed novelty songs, it doesn't seem like the two would mesh particularly well. It's something I know to be true, but it is a supposition. Now, we get to a subject that puzzles me a great deal. In December of 1945, just a few months after the end of World War II, a musical entitled Billion Dollar Baby opened on Broadway. The play, directed by well-known Broadway director George Abbott, was a Prohibition-era tale of a gold-digging woman who ran over anyone in her path in her quest to seduce and marry a billionaire. While an ambitious idea that received a great deal of promotion, it was not well received by audiences and ran for only about 6 months before being canceled. What confuses me is that Ben collected a great deal of information on this play. It turned into apparently some sort of an obsession with him. Now, he has copies of Playbill newspaper and magazine articles, programs, just about every scrap of information about this production, and yet can find no record of his involvement. He's not listed as being in the cast or involved in any of the musical compositions or arrangements. There are two possibilities that have occurred to me. As best I can figure, he was either A, an uncredited consultant whose knowledge of 1920s jazz would have been very useful in originating scenes with a high degree of authenticity, or B, he was a member of the orchestra. And since I can't find a listing of the members of the orchestra, I can't confirm or deny that option. But it does seem to me that would be in keeping with his usual role of being a supporting musician in a larger orchestra. This role would have put him out of work in mid-1946, and there's a gap in his chronology to 1948, at which point we can find him working as an arranger for Xavier Cugat. In fact, however, it would be unusual to find the name of Ben Pickering associated with Cugat in the late 1940s because he was using the pseudonym Roberto Ray. It's a little unclear why he chose to use an assumed name while working with Cugat, but a good guess would be that at the time Cugat was performing a great deal in Latin America, particularly in Cuba, and Ray is a fairly common surname in many South American countries, so perhaps he thought that would make him more popular with the Latin American crowds and fellow performers. Here are a few more odds and ends that I picked up that I also wanted to include in this video from the 1940s. Don't have any particular relevance to these. They just happened to show up, and he happened to have them in his collection, so I thought they were worthwhile showing. Well, that's it for this week. Next week, we'll be moving into the 1950s with an entirely new cast of characters. That will be the last foray into the Oh, the People You'll Meet series, since Ben only worked sporadically after the 1950s, mainly retired and living in New York. After that, we'll be taking a step back and moving away from the history of Ben Pickering for a while to discuss some of the larger significant events that influenced the overall evolution of jazz as a discrete genre. In 2 weeks, for example, we'll be discussing the suppression of jazz in the mid to late 1930s by the Nazi regime in Germany. This idea flows out of a book I read a while back covering the rise of the Nazis in their playground of Munich and how many of the things the Nazis publicly declared decadent and therefore verboten or actually flowed quite freely in that Bavarian paradise. So I look forward to you joining me for that. Also, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. That way you can be informed when I post new videos. I'm also looking into some interesting ideas, one of them being to do reaction videos to old jazz records. This is a very popular category in YouTube land these days where people are exposed to music that they wouldn't typically listen to and then film their reactions to what they hear. And of course, most of this is centered around classic rock, but I haven't seen that covering early jazz. So it seemed like a good way to immerse myself in a style of music that I'm still largely unfamiliar with. And of course, this also introduces more people to songs that they may have never heard before as well. So that's one direction I might decide to pursue. But if anyone has any idea of something they'd like to see, I want to be responsive to my audience. So, go ahead and drop me a comment. Other than that, we'll see you next week.